I believe that as humans we have an inherent instinctive attraction to the sea. I can spend hours watching the surf roll in on a rocky coastline or lap gently on a sandy shore. Seascapes for me represent a particular technical challenge for photography. As a subject, these landscapes are inherently dynamic, and it's this that represents both the challenge and the joy that these landscapes can bring to the photographer. The sea can be calm and peaceful at one moment, or it can rage and intimidate at the next. As Herman Melville once put it, there's a magic in the water that draws us away from the land, that leads us over hills, down creeks and streams and rivers to the sea. In this video, I'll cover the details of how I approach photographing seascapes, from flat sandy beaches to rocky cliffs, and from tranquil, calm evenings to raging storms. Beaches represent so many different opportunities for the landscape photographer. Sandy beaches tend to lend themselves best to creating calm images using the softer light of sunsets and preferably taking advantage of a retreating tide to photograph clean, wet sand that reflects the colours of the sky. When photographing sandy beaches, I like to keep an eye out for patterns in the sand that catch my eye, and in particular, I'll keep an eye out for S-curves and lead-in lines. Frequently, you'll find streams that wash out over the sand, and these streams will usually form natural S-curves, which help to lead the viewer's eye through an image. At low tide, the retreating sea leaves behind ridges and patterns that you can feature in the foreground. I've also frequently used washed-up seaweed or driftwood to provide a focal point. The black sand beaches along the southern coast of Iceland are particularly popular with landscape photographers, especially the famous Diamond Beach near Jökulsárlón Glacier Lagoon. Here the icebergs floating in the lagoon are washed out to sea and then thrown back up onto the beach. These lumps of ice provide the perfect focal point to feature in the foreground of your images. Sandy beaches are commonly associated with crashing surf, and a composition that I've turned to many times on a sandy beach, from the Seychelles to the Outer Hebrides, is an image of a crashing wave captured at just the right shutter speed to show the movement in the water. I usually find that a shutter speed of around half a second, normally 0.6 seconds, works best for these images. Patience and persistence is key when taking images like this. On this evening at Luskentyre Beach on the Isle of Harris, I spent hours taking images of the same scene over and over as the waves kept coming in, but the time just seemed to fly by. I find the process becomes addictive, with the belief that no matter how good the image you just took might be, the next wave might just be a little bit better. Waves normally arrive at the shore in groups of 5 or 6, with a lull in between. Often it's the second or third wave in a set that leads to the best image, as it meets the retreating water from the preceding wave. Use a wide-angle lens and keep your camera low, but make sure you keep clear of the water. Luskentyre Beach on the Isle of Harris provides, in my opinion, the perfect composition for these types of images, as there are layers within the composition, from the waves in the foreground to the hills on the horizon. Including layers of depth in your scene is always a good way to go when creating landscape images, and when walking along sandy shores, I'm often on the lookout of ways to do this, whether it's including a headland in the background, a sea stack, an island, or even an iceberg. Of course, behind every good sandy beach lies a good dune system. Dunes can naturally lend themselves well to photographic compositions, and I like to look out for curves in the crests of dunes, lead-in lines, and patterns in the sand formed by the wind. Black and white images of dunes often work well, especially if there is an oppressive sky overhead. When there's a breeze blowing from marram grass, I also find a longer exposure can create some really interesting effects. When the swell is up, the rocky shoreline is probably the best place to be, especially if you plan to photograph the waves themselves. Remember though that these exposed locations can be treacherous. Also, when photographing heavy swells, always be aware of rogue waves. Even when the weather is calm, rogue waves can occur at any time. I would normally spend a good amount of time when first arriving at a location, just observing the waves and seeing how they come. The shoreline itself can form interesting shapes and forms that make for good landscape photographs in these areas. Small inlets work well, as waves enter and swirl around, creating lovely patterns and shapes. Again, I like to go for around a quarter to a half second exposure for these images. One of my favourite subjects to photograph along rocky shores are sea stacks. Perhaps one of the most famous sea stacks is Reynisdrangar near Vik, on the southern shore of Iceland. These impressive Gothic-looking sea stacks are certainly well photographed, but with good reason as they're extremely photogenic. This area is famous though for its rip tides. The sea here can very quickly sweep you out to sea, so don't take any chances. Wave photography is almost a separate genre in its own right, and has been exemplified by photographers such as Rachel Talabart, who have made a speciality out of photographing waves. It's certainly one of the most active and exciting forms of landscape photography. To really capture the power of a crashing wave, you need conditions to be just right, and you need to be in the right location. Keep an eye on weather forecasts, and in particular, look out for low pressure systems sitting out to sea, as these will lead to large swells. As mentioned earlier, I do like to use shutter speeds of around a quarter to half a second to create movement in the water. These speeds keep some definition in the water, adding dynamics to your images. Longer shutter speeds will create a more ethereal look, which can look aesthetic, but can also make the scene look a little unrealistic in my opinion. To capture the essence of a powerful wave, however, you normally need to go for a fast shutter speed. This can seem contrary to most forms of landscape photography, but when capturing waves, fast shutter speeds really are key, so don't be afraid of increasing the ISO. On the other hand, sometimes a slightly longer exposure can be good for achieving more abstract images, so spend some time experimenting and don't be afraid to fill up your memory cards. There are certain specific challenges to photographing seascapes that you don't normally need to take into consideration with other forms of landscape photography. Perhaps the most obvious of these is tides. When I'm planning landscape shoots, I tend to plan primarily around whether or not to photograph a scene at sunrise or sunset. With most landscapes, it's fairly easy to predict when to go and photograph a scene at the right time of day using apps such as the Photo Ephemeris. But with seascapes, you also need to take into consideration where the tide will be. You might find a particular rock formation that you want to photograph at sunset, but depending on the tide, you may not be able to access or even see that rock formation. Make sure that you check for tides when planning your shoots to avoid any disappointment when you arrive at a location. When I visited Milford Sound in New Zealand, I found myself making this very basic mistake. When I first arrived at the scene, I had a bit of time before sunset, so merrily went around scouting out interesting foregrounds to feature in my photograph once sunset arrived. After looking around at various logs, I found one log in particular that I decided was going to be my main foreground interest, and fortunately, fired off this long exposure image as a test shot. By the time sunset arrived, however, I'd completely underestimated how fast and how far the tide would come in, and the log was completely submerged. Tides also warrant a particular safety notice as well, of course. When conditions are good, it's easy to get carried away with the photography and forget to check what the tide is doing. It can be all too easy not to notice that the tide is coming in, so make sure that you don't get cut off from the mainland or that your camera ends up in the sea. I find that apps designed by the surfing community also work well for photographers, as they will aim to tell you what the tides and wave conditions will be like at a certain location. Probably the best app for predicting coastal conditions is Magic Seaweed. For most coastal scenes, I'll normally opt for a wide-angle lens, especially if I'm looking to feature foregrounds heavily in my images. My 16-35mm lens would therefore be my most likely go-to lens for most of these images. To achieve good close-up photographs of waves, however, you'll want to go for a telephoto lens, and anything over 200mm will be ideal. I usually have a polarizing filter permanently fitted to my lens when photographing seascapes. The only time I would consider not using one is if I'm trying to capture reflections. At other times though, it will reduce surface glare, helping to bring out the colours and waves and reducing the shine on wet rocks. I normally include an ND filter when photographing seascapes unless light levels are low, such as during the blue hour when an ND filter may not be needed to achieve longer exposures. I probably have to admit at this stage though that whereas the use of a 10-stop NDs seems to be particularly popular among photographers when photographing these types of shoreline, my own preference is usually to go for a slightly shorter exposure time. I find that I tend to use my 6-stop filter a lot more than my 10-stop. This is just a personal preference and my own taste, but I do find that the ethereal look of the very long exposures lasting minutes rather than seconds can result in some of the drama of the scene being lost. For longer exposures, you'll need a good sturdy tripod, and I also prefer carbon fibre tripods as they're less prone to corrosion. I usually shoot with a camera positioned low, which emphasises the foreground and gives a more pleasing perspective. For this reason, it's best to have a tripod that allows you to spread the legs wider, creating a more stable setup. I find a remote shutter release essential so that you're not touching or moving your camera when taking images. When photographing static scenes, a 2-second delay is often sufficient, but when photographing dynamic scenes like you're doing with seascapes, it pays to be able to trigger images immediately to capture waves at just the right moment. And to do this, you really do need a remote shutter release. One big thing to be aware of when photographing on the shoreline, and certainly not something to take lightly, is the toll that these environments can take on your equipment. Salt and sand do not mix well with camera equipment, and it's important to take as much care of your gear as you can. On the few occasions when I have had to send my equipment off to be serviced, it's always been after a coastal photography shoot. All of my main lenses are weather sealed, but even in a light breeze, sand can easily get into the focus rings, and in a strong wind, there's even the potential for blowing sand to scratch your front element. For this reason, coastal photography is an example of an occasion where I personally prefer to keep a UV filter on the front of my lens for protection. Some photographers feel that this will cause too much detriment to image quality, but honestly, I barely notice any difference when using a high-quality UV filter. And with coastal photography, the risks of permanent damage to expensive equipment are simply not worth the risk of not using them. Even the most expensive tripods can quickly start to deteriorate as well if you use them regularly for coastal photography. Salt can lead to corrosion of any exposed metal screws and fixtures on your tripod, and for this reason, I prefer tripods with screw leg fixtures rather than clamps, as these are easier to take apart and clean. After any shoot at the coast, I will normally take apart my tripod as soon as I get home and give all the components a good rinse in the shower to remove any salt or sand that may have worked its way into the threads. Also be aware that sea spray will often leave a salt deposit on your camera and filters, so keep some lens cloths handy and clean everything as soon as you can after your shoot. Despite the challenges they present for landscape photography, I find seascapes to be perhaps the most exciting landscapes to photograph. No other landscape can be so dynamic and changeable from one moment to the next, and seascapes have provided me with some of my most exciting experiences in landscape photography. I find that time can quickly flash by without me even noticing when I'm trying to capture the perfect seascape. In contrast to mountains, which remain constant, the seas are ever-changing and constantly providing us with new scenes to capture. Sometimes these environments can seem too hostile, but at others, there's nowhere more tranquil, and the pure variety of what these environments can offer is what makes them one of my favourite subjects to photograph. In my next video in this series, I'll be discussing perhaps one of the most frustrating landscapes to try and photograph, but also one of the most popular, as we head to the woodlands.